She walked in to show him a heartbeat on a screen. She walked out into the rain with two heartbeats inside her and a marriage she'd just watched die on his desk. 4 years later, the man she ran from found her, and the eyes staring back at her from her son's face were his. Stay with me to the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The envelope sat in her purse like a live wire. Vivian Hale had been carrying it around for 6 hours, through the pharmacy, through the parking garage, through the slow elevator ride up to the penthouse floor of a building she still wasn't used to calling home. And every time her hand brushed the strap of that purse, she felt her pulse jump like she'd touched a stove. It was a sonogram. Black and white, grainy, two little smudges that the technician had circled in blue pen and said, "There's your first and there's your second. Twins." Vivian had sat in that exam room with the paper crinkling under her, staring at the ceiling tiles, and laughed. Not the kind of laugh that means something's funny. The kind that comes out of you when your whole life just turned a corner you didn't know was there. She hadn't told Damien yet. She wanted to see his face. That was the whole plan. Walk into his study at 7 before the bodyguards did their last sweep of the floor, before the night swallowed him up in whatever it was he did after dark that he never talked about, and put that photo in his hands and watch the ice in those gray eyes crack for once. She'd been married to him for 2 years. She still didn't fully understand him. Maybe nobody did. Damien Volkov didn't raise his voice, didn't slam doors, didn't need to. Men twice his size went quiet when he walked into a room, and she used to think that was something dangerous and magnetic about him, before she understood it was just fear wearing a suit. She'd married into something she didn't have a name for, not officially. Nobody said the word mafia over dinner, but she'd seen the men who came and went from his offices, heard the silences that fell over rooms, noticed how certain newspapers never printed certain names. She knew enough. She told herself the love was worth not knowing the rest. The hallway to his study was long, lined with art that cost more than her childhood house, and her low heels made no sound on the marble because she'd taken them off at the elevator, padding along in stocking feet like a kid sneaking down on Christmas morning. She was smiling. God, she could still feel that smile on her face later, like a brand, like evidence of how stupid hope could make you. She didn't knock. That was the first mistake, if you wanted to call it that, though nobody ever blamed a wife for not knocking on her own husband's door. The door was cracked 2 inches, light spilling out gold across the hallway runner, and she heard voices before she saw anything. Low. His voice, clipped, controlled. The voice he used when something had gone wrong and he hadn't decided yet who to be angry at. And a woman's voice, breathless, broken up by something that might have been crying. Vivian's hand was already on the door. She pushed it open the rest of the way without thinking, the sonogram photo pressed flat against her ribs under her crossed arm like a shield, like a gift she hadn't unwrapped yet. And what she saw took the floor out from under her so fast she had to grab the frame just to stay standing. Damien had a woman pinned against the edge of his desk. His hands were on her, one gripping her arm hard enough to leave marks, the other pressed flat against her side. Her shirt rucked up, dark stains soaking through pale fabric. The woman's head was tipped back, dark hair spilling over Damien's forearm, her breath coming in these short, hitching gasps that in any other context, in any other universe, Vivian would have read exactly one way. And then the woman turned her face toward the door. Cassidy, her own sister. 3 years younger, dimples Vivian used to kiss on her cheeks when she was a baby. The same crooked left incisor Vivian had. The same laugh that used to fill up their mother's tiny kitchen. Cassidy Hale, looking at Vivian over Damien's shoulder with an expression that wasn't shame and wasn't guilt. It was something closer to terror, but Vivian's brain didn't have room to parse fine distinctions right then. Her brain had stopped working in nuance. Her brain had narrowed down to one single, blinding fact. Her husband's hands were on her sister's body, and her sister's shirt was open, and there was a dark wet stain spreading across pale cloth. And 4 months pregnant with his children, Vivian Hale stood in the doorway of her own home and felt the entire architecture of her life come down around her ears without a single sound. "Vivian?" Damien's head snapped up. His voice cracked, actually cracked, something she'd never once heard happen to that voice in 2 years. And his hand came off Cassidy's arm like he'd been burned. She didn't answer him. She didn't ask the question. She would think about that later, for years. lying awake in a narrow bed 3,000 miles from that study, turning it over like a stone in her palm. Why didn't I ask? Why didn't I demand a single word of explanation before I let the worst thing I could imagine become the only thing I believed? But standing there in that doorway, with the photograph of her unborn children pressed to her chest like something she needed to protect from the room itself, she didn't have words. She had a roar in her ears like the ocean, and underneath the roar, very quietly, the sound of every choice she'd ever made about this man rearranging itself into a story about a fool who married a monster. She turned around. She walked back down the hallway in her stocking feet, picked her heels up off the floor by the elevator without putting them on, and rode down 22 floors with her back pressed to the mirrored wall, watching her own reflection multiply into infinity on either side of her. 100 Vivians in pale blue dresses, none of them crying yet, all of them waiting for the bottom to actually drop out. It dropped out somewhere around the lobby. By the time the valet asked if she needed her car, tears were running freely enough that he stopped asking questions and just opened the door for her, gentle, the way you'd handle something fragile that had clearly already been dropped once. She didn't go home. She drove to a motel 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with a flickering vacancy sign and a front desk clerk who didn't look up from his phone. And she sat on the edge of a bed with a bedspread that smelled like somebody else's cigarettes, and she made a list. Not a plan, not yet. A list. Cash, $3,000 she'd been saving in an account Damien didn't know about because some instinct she'd never examined too closely had told her, 2 years into a marriage to a man whose business she didn't ask about, that a woman should always have money nobody else can touch. Passport. The small leather bag she kept packed for nothing in particular, the kind of bag you tell yourself is for emergencies and never think too hard about what kind. And the sonogram photo, still creased where her arm had pressed it against her ribs in that study, still warm from her own body heat. She looked at the photo for a long time that night. 2 smudges. 2 heartbeats. A future she'd planned to build with a man who, 4 hours earlier, she would have sworn on anything sacred would never touch another woman, and who she now believed completely with the kind of certainty that only comes from catastrophic heartbreak, was exactly the kind of monster everyone had quietly warned her he might be. She thought about Cassidy's face, the terror in it. She told herself that was guilt. She told herself a lot of things that night that she would later understand were her own grief talking, trying to make a clean story out of something jagged and unfinished, because clean stories are easier to run from than complicated ones. By morning, she had a bus ticket to Sacramento, cash in 3 different pockets, so a single pickpocket couldn't take everything, and a decision made with the kind of finality that doesn't leave room for second thoughts. Whatever was growing inside her would not grow up the way Damien Volkov had grown up, in a house where men disappeared and nobody asked where loyalty got measured in blood and violence wore a $2,000 suit. She would disappear instead. She would take her children somewhere so far outside that world that the world would never think to look. She didn't know yet that disappearing from a man like Damien Volkov was a kind of arithmetic she had badly underestimated. She didn't know that 4 years from that motel room, she'd be standing in a grocery store parking lot in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, watching 3 black SUVs roll to a stop like something out of a nightmare she thought she'd successfully outrun. She just knew that night, with mascara dried in tracks down both cheeks and a stranger's cigarette smell in her hair, that she was already gone. The decision had made itself. All that was left was the running. The town was called Wren's Point, and it sat on the Oregon coast like something the rest of the world had forgotten to finish building. One blinking light at the only real intersection. A grocery store with a hand-painted sign. A diner called The Anchor that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and fryer grease, where Vivian Hale, though here, on every form, every paycheck stub, every library card, she was Vivian Hayes, had worked the early shift for going on 3 years. She was 28 years old, and her hands had calluses now from carrying too many plates stacked too high. And there were 2 5-year-old boys waiting for her at the daycare 2 blocks over who had no idea that the woman who packed their lunches and sang off-key in the truck on the way to school had once worn a wedding ring worth more than the diner she worked in. Jack and Noah. Born 9 weeks early in a hospital in Bend, Oregon, 2 months after she'd arrived in town with nothing but a duffel bag, and a fear that had calcified somewhere in her chest into something permanent, something that lived behind her ribs like a second heartbeat. Jack had come out screaming. Noah had come out quiet, watchful, like he was already cataloging the room. They were identical in every way except their eyes, which Vivian used to tell herself were just a color, nothing more, a pale, striking gray that didn't belong to her family at all, that belonged entirely and unmistakably to a man 3,000 miles away who didn't know they existed. She told herself that was for the best. She told herself that every single night for 4 years, lying in a bed in a rented house with thin walls and a leaking roof, listening to the boys breathe in the next room, telling herself a story about safety that she needed to believe in order to keep getting up every morning at 4:45 to open the diner. It wasn't an easy life. She wasn't going to pretend it was, not even to herself, not on the bad days when the truck wouldn't start in the cold, or when Noah came home from kindergarten with a black eye because some kid had made fun of his hand-me-down shoes and Jack had decked the kid in his defense. 2 5-year-olds already learning the particular grammar of loyalty and violence that Vivian had crossed a country to keep them away from. It wasn't easy, watching every dollar, clipping coupons, working doubles on Mondays so she could afford the boys' shoes for the next growth spurt, falling asleep most nights before she even got her makeup off. But it was hers. It was clean. Nobody in Wren's Point had ever heard the name Volkov, and the diner's owner, a 60-year-old widow named Dot who'd hired Vivian on her first day in town without asking a single hard question, had become something like the family Vivian had lost when she lost her sister, and lost the life she thought she was supposed to have. She still thought about Cassidy, more than she let herself admit. There were nights she almost picked up a payphone, actual payphones, the kind that still existed in towns like this, and dialed the old number, just to hear her sister's voice, just to ask the question she should have asked 4 years earlier in a doorway with gold light spilling across marble. But every time her finger hovered over the numbers, she thought about black SUVs and men in suits, and the particular silence that used to fall over rooms when Damien walked into them. And she put the receiver down, and she went home to her boys instead. That Saturday morning started like every other Saturday morning. Up before dawn, hair in a ponytail, the boys still half asleep and cranky in their booster seats while she drove the 15 minutes into town for the grocery run she did every week before her shift. Milk, eggs, the cheap cereal Jack liked, and the expensive one Noah refused to eat anything but, a routine so worn into her bones she could have done it blind. The parking lot of Henley's grocery had maybe a dozen cars in it on a normal Saturday. Vivian parked the truck in her usual spot near the cart return, told the boys to hold hands crossing the lot the way she told them every single time, and was reaching into the back seat to unbuckle Noah when she heard the sound. Engines. More than one. A low, synchronized hum that didn't belong anywhere near a gravel lot in a town where the loudest thing that usually happened was the foghorn at the lighthouse. She straightened up, one hand still on the truck door, and watched 3 black SUVs roll into the lot in a tight formation that looked less like parking and more like a maneuver, like something rehearsed, and every cell in her body went cold and still at once. The particular stillness of an animal that has just heard a sound it recognizes from somewhere deep and old and dangerous. She had 4 seconds, maybe 5, before the doors of the lead vehicle opened. In that handful of seconds, her mind did the thing minds do in real danger. It didn't panic, not yet. It went very clear and very fast, cataloging exits, calculating distance to the truck's ignition, doing the math on whether she could get both boys back in their seats and the truck started before whoever was in those vehicles reached her. The math didn't work. She knew that before she finished doing it. A man stepped out of the lead SUV first, tall, broad through the shoulders, a dark coat despite the mild morning, the unmistakable bearing of someone whose job was simply to stand between danger and another person. Vivian's stomach dropped through the gravel beneath her feet. She didn't recognize his face specifically, but she recognized the type, recognized it in her bones the way you recognize a smell from childhood you didn't know you remembered. And then the rear door of the second SUV opened, and a man stepped out who she had spent 4 years and 3,000 miles trying not to remember the exact shape of, and every plan she'd ever made for this moment. And she had made plans, dozens of them, lying awake at 3 in the morning imagining exactly this. Every single plan evaporated, because nothing she had imagined had prepared her for what it would actually feel like to see Damien Volkov standing in a grocery store parking lot, looking directly at her, after 4 years of silence so complete she had half convinced herself he'd stopped looking. He hadn't stopped looking. She understood that immediately, looking at his face. Whatever else had happened in those 4 years, whatever else he'd done with his power and his money, and the terrible patience of a man like him, he had not stopped looking for one single day. "Mom?" Jack's voice came from behind her, small and confused, and Vivian's entire body turned to ice at the sound of it because she watched Damien's eyes, that pale, unmistakable gray, leave her face for the first time and travel past her shoulder, down to the height of a 5-year-old boy standing half out of a truck door. And she watched something happen to her husband's face that she had genuinely never seen happen to it in 2 years of marriage. It cracked. Not loudly, not visibly to anyone who hadn't spent 2 years learning to read the smallest movements of that controlled, careful face. But Vivian had spent 2 years learning exactly that, and she saw it. The muscle that jumped once in his jaw, the breath that left him like he'd been hit somewhere soft, the way his hand, halfway through reaching to button his coat, simply stopped moving and hung there in the air like he'd forgotten what it was for. He was looking at Jack's eyes, his own eyes, staring back at him from a face that belonged to a child he had never been told existed. "Get in the truck," Vivian said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Steady in the particular way that only comes from 4 years of practicing exactly this kind of calm for the sake of small children who didn't need to see their mother fall apart. "Jack, baby, get in the truck right now." But it was already too late. The man in the dark coat had crossed half the parking lot already, moving with the unhurried, inevitable pace of someone who has never once in his life needed to run to get what he wanted. And Vivian's hand found Noah's small shoulder and pulled him back behind her. And she stood there in the gravel lot of a grocery store in a town that didn't even have a stoplight, putting her own body between her sons and the father they had never met. 4 years of careful, exhausting, lonely safety, collapsing in the space of about 11 seconds. "Vivian," Damien's voice. Closer now. Lower than she remembered, or maybe just rougher. 4 years of something. Searching, she would understand later, though right now all she could hear in it was threat, having worn it down to something with edges in it. 4 years. Don't. The word came out of her like a blade, sharper than she meant it, sharp enough that she felt Noah flinch behind her. "Don't you dare. Not here. Not in front of them." "You knew." He wasn't shouting. He never shouted. She remembered that now. Remembered it with a kind of nausea. The controlled voice, the stillness, the way violence lived underneath Damien Volkov, not as an outburst, but as a permanent waiting pressure, like weather. "You knew, and you ran, and you let me spend 4 years not knowing if you were alive. I know exactly what I saw." Her voice broke on the last word despite everything, despite 4 years of practice keeping it steady, and she hated herself for that crack, even as it happened. "I saw you with my sister. I saw—" She stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence with Noah's small fingers gripping the hem of her shirt, with Jack standing frozen by the truck door, staring at a stranger with his own eyes. Damien's face did something complicated then, something between fury and grief. The two emotions so tangled together in him that Vivian, even after everything, even hating him as completely as she'd trained herself to over 4 hard years, couldn't tell which one was winning. "You don't know anything," he said, quiet, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "You saw 5 seconds and you ran for 4 years on 5 seconds, and you took my children with you, and you let me believe—" His voice did crack then, finally, the way she'd heard it crack only once before, in a doorway with gold light spilling across marble. "You let me believe you were dead, Vivian, for 4 years. The man in the dark coat had reached them now, standing a respectful 2 paces back, and Vivian understood with a sick, sinking certainty that there was no scenario here, no version of this Saturday morning, in which she simply got back in her truck with her sons and drove away. The math she'd done in the first 5 seconds had been wrong in the most important way. She had calculated distance and timing, but she hadn't calculated the fact that a man with 3 black SUVs and 4 years of waiting behind him does not let a target go that easily, not when the target is standing 6 feet away with his own children's faces. "Please," she said, and hated the begging note in it, hated it, and couldn't stop it. "Whatever you want from me, leave them out of it. They don't know anything about your world, about any of it. Let me take them home and we can talk, just talk. Anywhere you want, but not... She gestured helplessly at the boys, at the gravel lot, at the small, ordinary Saturday morning that was disintegrating around all four of them. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, down again, at Jack, who had found some kind of courage from somewhere, some 5-year-old's instinct that said, "Protect Mom," and had stepped half in front of Noah, small chin lifted, jaw set in an expression that was, Vivian realized with a jolt, that hit her like cold water, identical to an expression she'd seen 100 times on his father's face. "What's your name?" Damien asked the boy, and his voice had changed completely. Gone was the edge, the rough threat underneath the control, replaced by something so careful, so unpracticed and tentative, that it didn't sound like the same man at all. Jack glanced up at his mother. Vivian gave the smallest possible nod, terrified, helpless, watching the whole architecture of the safe small life she'd built collapse exactly the way the other one had 4 years earlier. In a doorway, in a parking lot, always in a doorway or a parking lot, always in some ordinary place that would never be ordinary again. "Jack," the boy said, "that's my brother Noah. He doesn't talk to strangers." Something happened on Damien Volkov's face that Vivian would spend the rest of her life trying to find a word for. It wasn't a smile. It was too raw, too unguarded for that. More like watching a wall come down in real time, brick by brick, 4 years of carefully constructed control simply giving out at the sight of a 5-year-old boy reciting a rule his mother had taught him for exactly this kind of danger. "Smart rule," Damien said, and his voice was unsteady in a way Vivian had genuinely never heard from him, not once, not in 2 years of marriage, not even on the worst nights when men with guns had called the penthouse line. "You should listen to your mother." "We have to go," Vivian said, and reached for both boys at once, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her ears, in the tips of her fingers. "We have groceries to get, and then we have to... You're coming with me." Damien's voice had gone flat again, the control snapping back over whatever had cracked open a moment earlier, and Vivian felt the temperature of the entire conversation drop 10 degrees. "All of you, now." "No." She put herself fully between him and the boys, every muscle in her body locked rigid, 4 years of fear distilled down into this single refusal. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up after 4 years and just take us. I have a life here. They have a life here. You don't get to walk into a parking lot and erase that because you found us. I'm not erasing anything." For the first time, something genuinely dangerous moved across his face, something that made the man in the dark coat shift his weight almost imperceptibly, the way a dog does when it senses its owner's mood turning. "I spent 4 years not knowing if my children were alive, Vivian. I spent 4 years tearing apart every city on this continent, looking for a woman who vanished off the face of the earth with my blood inside her. You do not get to stand in a parking lot and tell me what I do and do not get to do." "They're not..." Vivian started and stopped herself because the lie was already useless, was already dead on her tongue, because Jack's gray eyes and Noah's gray eyes were standing right there in the gravel doing all the talking that needed doing. "I want to know why," Damien said, and his voice dropped low enough that it was almost only for her, almost private, though nothing about this parking lot felt private at all. "I want to hear you say it. Why you ran. Why you took 4 years of my children's lives and never once let me know they existed. You owe me that much, Vivian. Whatever else you think I am, you owe me that." And there it was. The question she had spent 4 years building an entire life specifically designed never to have to answer. The question that lived underneath every shift at the diner, every bedtime story, every birthday she'd celebrated alone with 2 small boys and a box mix cake, every single night she'd lain awake telling herself she'd done the right thing, the only thing, the thing any mother would do. She looked at him, really looked, for the first time in 4 years, at the face she used to wake up next to, weathered now in ways she hadn't expected. Older around the eyes, carved through with something that looked, God help her, almost like grief. And she felt the truth rise up in her throat, where she'd kept it buried for so long it had nearly calcified into something else entirely. "Fine," she said, and her voice shook, and she let it shake, because she was so tired, suddenly, so unbelievably tired of carrying this alone. "You want to know why? Get in your car, send your men away from my children, and I'll tell you exactly why I ran, Damien. I'll tell you exactly what I saw that night in your study, and exactly why I have spent 4 years making sure my sons never had to grow up anywhere near a man who could do something like that to the people who trusted him most. Something flickered behind his eyes. Confusion, maybe, or the first thin edge of something Vivian wouldn't understand the shape of for hours yet, not until they were both standing in that same study 3,000 miles away, with the truth laid out cold and devastating between them. "Get in the car," he said quietly. "Both of you. We'll go somewhere the boys can eat, and then you're going to tell me everything you think you saw 4 years ago." He paused, and for just a moment something almost like fear moved across his face. Fear that didn't belong on a man like him. Fear that looked entirely unfamiliar wearing his features. "And then I'm going to tell you what actually happened." Vivian stood frozen in the gravel, her hand locked around Noah's small shoulder, Jack pressed close against her hip, and somewhere behind her ribs, underneath 4 years of carefully maintained certainty, a single crack of doubt opened up and let in a thin, terrifying sliver of light. What if she'd been wrong? The truck ride to wherever Damien intended to take them lasted maybe 4 minutes, but Vivian spent every one of them with her jaw clenched so hard her molars ached, watching the back of Jack's head where he sat strapped into his booster seat between two SUVs full of armed men he didn't understand, chattering at his brother about whether they were going to get pancakes. Noah didn't say anything. Noah never said much, but he was watching the man in the front passenger seat. Not Damien. Damien rode in a separate vehicle, which Vivian understood without being told was deliberate. A buffer of distance and protocol that probably governed every part of his life now. Watching him with the particular stillness of a child who has decided something is wrong and is filing it away to think about later. She reached over and squeezed his knee, and he looked at her, and she tried to put something reassuring into her face that she did not feel even slightly. They ended up at a diner 2 towns over, not the Anchor, someplace Vivian had never been. Booth seats cracked with age, a jukebox in the corner that didn't work anymore. The man in the dark coat, she'd heard one of the others call him Reyes, took up a position by the door like a piece of furniture, arms crossed, eyes moving over the room every few seconds in a pattern Vivian recognized from years ago and had spent 4 years trying to forget the rhythm of. Damien sat across from her. The boys sat between them on Vivian's side, both of them attacking pancakes with the kind of total, blissful unawareness only small children can manage in the middle of their parents' worst day. Vivian watched Damien watch his sons eat. He didn't say much at first. He just watched, like a man memorizing something he was afraid would disappear if he blinked. "You have syrup on your chin," he told Jack at one point, and his voice came out wrong, too soft, cracked at the edges in a way that made Vivian's stomach twist. "I always have syrup on my chin," Jack said, matter of fact, not even looking up, and went back to his pancakes, and Damien laughed. One short, broken sound, more pain than humor, and looked away out the window for a second like he needed to get his face back under control. Vivian watched all of it and felt something cold crawling up the back of her neck. Not because it was fake, because it wasn't. She had spent 4 years building a story in her head where Damien Volkov was a monster who wouldn't care, who'd see his sons as leverage or liability, and instead she was watching a man come apart at the seams over a kid having syrup on his face. And that didn't fit anywhere in the story she'd built. And she hated how much that scared her. When the plates were cleared, Reyes appeared at the booth without being summoned and crouched down to Jack's eye level. "Hey, little man, you and your brother want to go look at the boats out back? There's a whole dock." He glanced at Vivian for permission, which she gave with a single stiff nod because she didn't trust her voice yet, and watched her sons walk off with a stranger toward a window that Reyes positioned himself outside of, visible the entire time, never more than 15 feet from them. Then it was just her and Damien. The booth. The cracked vinyl. 4 years of silence sitting on the table between them like a third presence neither of them wanted to acknowledge. "Talk," he said. "You first," Vivian shot back. "You're the one who showed up with 3 SUVs full of men in a grocery store parking lot like you were repossessing a car. You talk first." His jaw worked. She watched him visibly restrain something. The old habit of control, except it looked thinner now, like 4 years had worn through whatever reserve used to make it look effortless. "I have been looking for you for 4 years, Vivian. 4 years. I had men in every state. I had a team going through every shelter, every motel, every diner from here to the Atlantic. I spent more money trying to find you than most people make in a lifetime. And I am going to ask you one time, calmly, and I need you to actually answer it instead of running again. Why? Why? She laughed, short and ugly, and felt the heat come up her throat before she could stop it. You want to know why? I'll tell you exactly why. I walked into your study to tell you we were having twins. I had the picture in my hand, Damien. I was smiling like an idiot the whole way up the elevator because I thought, God, I actually thought you'd be happy. And I walked in and you had your hands all over my sister, shirt open, her gasping. You pressed up against her like her voice cracked and she hated it, hated giving him that. Like I wasn't even a thought in your head anymore. Something flickered hard across his face. That's what you saw. That's what happened. That is not what happened. His voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the way it used to get right before something bad happened to somebody who wasn't her. And for one disorienting second, old fear and new fury tangled together in her chest so tight she could barely breathe. Cassidy showed up at my office that night bleeding from her side. She'd been beaten. Loan sharks, Vivian, the kind of men who collect on debts with knives, because your sister had a habit she never told you about, a habit that put her $7,000 in debt to people who do not send polite reminders. She came to me because she didn't know who else to call, because she knew I had a doctor on retainer who wouldn't ask questions and wouldn't call the police, and I had her on that desk because I was holding pressure on a wound until he arrived. That is what you walked in on. That is the 5 seconds you built 4 years out of. Vivian's whole body had gone very still. You're lying. I have never lied to you. Something raw broke through the control then, his hand coming down flat on the table hard enough that the silverware jumped, hard enough that Reyes's head turned a fraction outside the window before he registered there was no actual threat and turned back. Not once. Not in 2 years of marriage. You decided I was a liar because it was easier than asking me a single question, and then you took my children and you let me spend 4 years believing you were dead in a ditch somewhere, and you want to sit here and tell me I'm lying. Don't you dare turn this around on me. Vivian's voice had risen, and she caught herself, glanced toward the window where her sons were crouched at the edge of the dock, looking at something in the water, oblivious, and brought it back down to a hiss. Don't you dare. I asked Cassidy. After. I called her eventually. A year later, I couldn't help myself, and you know what she told me? Nothing. She didn't deny it. She didn't explain anything. She just cried and told me she was sorry and hung up on me. Damien went very still. You talked to her. Once, a year ago, barely a conversation. Vivian's hands were shaking now and she pressed them flat against the table to stop it. She apologized, Damien. People who didn't do anything wrong don't apologize like that. She apologized because she's been carrying guilt for 4 years that has nothing to do with what you think it has to do with. His voice had gone rough, almost desperate, a register she had genuinely never heard from him in 2 years of marriage and 4 years of imagining every version of this conversation. She apologized because the last time her sister saw her sister ran, and Cassidy has spent every day since believing that whatever happened to you and those boys out there in the world was partly her fault for not chasing you down the hallway that night and telling you the truth herself. Then why didn't she? Because she was in surgery 2 hours later, Vivian. She was on a table getting 11 stitches and starting 6 months of rehab that I paid for and never told you about because you were already gone by the time she came out of anesthesia. His eyes had gone hard and wet at the same time, an expression Vivian didn't have a category for on his face. You want to know what else she's been doing for 4 years? Getting clean, actually clean. She's 18 months sober right now. She has a sponsor and a job and an apartment in Queens that she pays for herself, and she asks me every single time I see her if there's any word. Any word at all. And I have had to tell her no for 4 years because the woman who could have cleared this whole thing up with one phone call decided instead to vanish off the planet with my unborn children. The diner had gone very quiet around them, or maybe it was just that Vivian's ears were ringing too loud to register anything else. She stared at him, and underneath the fury, underneath 4 years of carefully maintained certainty, something was beginning to crack open inside her chest, slow and sick and terrible, like watching a dam she'd built with her own hands start to show its first hairline fracture. You're saying I imagined it. I'm saying you saw something real and built the worst possible story out of it instead of asking me a single question. His voice had dropped again, quieter now, which somehow made it land harder. You knew me for 2 years, Vivian, 2 years of marriage. Did I ever once raise a hand to you? Did I ever once give you a single reason to think I'd touch your sister behind your back? I didn't think you would. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. That's the whole point. I didn't think you would, and then I saw it with my own eyes, and I didn't know what else to believe. You could have believed me. You could have asked me. That's what people do, Vivian, when they love someone. They ask the question instead of running for 4 years on an assumption. He leaned forward, and for the first time since the parking lot, she saw something underneath the anger that looked almost like begging. Do you have any idea what those 4 years were like for me? I had no idea if you were alive. I had no idea if my children were alive. I built an entire search operation around a woman who might have been dead in a river somewhere for all I knew, and every single lead came back empty. And I kept going because the alternative was admitting that I'd lost everything in 5 seconds I never got the chance to explain. Vivian's hands had gone cold on the table. She thought about the night in the motel, the bedspread that smelled like cigarettes, the list she'd made with the certainty of a woman who believed she was protecting her children from a monster. She thought about every night since then, every double shift, every birthday alone, every story she'd told herself to make the running feel righteous instead of reckless. The blood, she said very quietly. There was blood on your desk. There was blood on my desk, Damien confirmed. Cassidy's blood. I had the desk replaced 2 weeks after you left because I couldn't look at it anymore. His jaw tightened. I kept the stain in my head a lot longer than I kept the actual desk, if you want to know the truth. I used to walk into that study and see it even after it was gone. I left the ultrasound photo, Vivian said suddenly, the memory surfacing out of nowhere, sharp and physical. The way grief does when you stop bracing against it for half a second. It must have fallen out of my purse, on the floor, by the door. Something moved across Damien's face that she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not control, something closer to devastation, raw and unguarded. He reached inside his coat, slow, like the motion cost him something, and laid a folded, worn square of paper on the table between them. The creases had gone soft with handling. The edges were starting to fray. Vivian looked down at it and felt the air leave her lungs. It was the sonogram. Her sonogram. The 2 smudged circles, the blue pen marks, 4 years old and carried clearly every single day since. I found it on the floor of my study the morning after you disappeared, Damien said, and his voice had gone hoarse. I didn't know what it was at first. I thought it was trash. And then I looked closer, and I understood that my wife had walked into that room to tell me I was going to be a father. And instead, she'd watched something happen that she misread completely, and she'd run before I ever got the chance to say a single word. He pushed it another inch toward her. I have carried that in my coat every single day for 4 years, Vivian. Every meeting, every flight, every dead-end lead that came back nothing. I carried it because it was the only proof I had that any of it was real, that I hadn't imagined a wife, that I hadn't imagined children, that somewhere out there 2 small people existed who shared my blood and didn't know I was looking for them. Vivian stared at the photo. Her hand came up without her permission, fingertips hovering an inch above the paper like she was afraid to actually touch it, afraid of what it would mean if she did. I thought you cheated on me, she said, and her voice broke completely this time, no controlling it. I thought you cheated on me with my own sister, and I built 4 years out of that. I built a whole life out of that. I taught my sons that their father was... She stopped. She couldn't finish it. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and felt the first genuine sob in years claw its way up out of her chest, ugly and uncontained, right there in a cracked vinyl booth in a diner 2 towns over from the only safety she'd managed to build in 4 years. Damien didn't reach for her. She would think about that later, too. That even in that moment, with everything cracking open between them, he held himself back like some part of him understood he hadn't earned the right to touch her yet. Not after everything. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter, he said instead. Low, controlled again, but in a different way now, careful instead of cold. What you believed about me for 4 years matters. It changed everything. It changed my sons' entire lives. But I need you to understand something, Vivian, and I need you to hear it clean, without the 4 years of fear talking over it. He waited until she looked up at him, eyes wet, breath still hitching. I never touched your sister the way you think I did. Not once. Not before that night. Not after. The worst thing I ever did to you was not chase you down that hallway and make you listen before you got in the elevator. That's my failure. That's mine to carry. But the affair you've spent 4 years grieving, it never happened, not for 1 second. Vivian sat with that for a long moment, the diner humming faintly around them, Reyes's silhouette steady outside the window where her sons were still crouched at the edge of the dock, oblivious to the fact that their entire understanding of who their father was had just been quietly detonated 40 feet away. "Why didn't you come after me?" she finally asked, the question coming out smaller and more wounded than she intended. "If it wasn't what I thought, why did it take you 4 years to find me? You're Damian Volkov. You said it yourself, you had men in every state. How does a woman with 2 kids and $3,000 in cash disappear from a man like you for 4 years? His expression shifted, something darker and more complicated moving behind his eyes. "Because you were smart," he said. "Smarter than I gave you credit for, which I should have expected, given that you married me without ever once asking the questions a smart woman should have asked about where the money came from. You used cash. You never touched a bank account in your real name again. You changed your name on every form that mattered and kept the original only where it counted. The boys' birth certificates, which, by the way, Vivian, I found eventually, 11 months ago, in a hospital records request that took my people the better part of a year to track down through 6 different jurisdictions. Because you were careful, you were so careful, and every month that went by without a lead, I started to believe the worst." "What's the worst?" Vivian asked, though some sick part of her already suspected the answer. "That you were dead," he said flatly. "That somebody from my world had found you before I did. I have enemies, Vivian. You knew that when you married me, even if you didn't know the details. There are men who would have loved nothing more than to find Damian Volkov's pregnant wife disappeared and unprotected, and use that fact against me in ways I don't particularly want to describe in front of you. Every month you were missing, I had to live with the possibility that somebody had gotten to you first, and that the reason I couldn't find you wasn't that you were hiding well. It was that you were already gone." The word landed in Vivian's chest like a stone dropped down a well, the sound of it echoing longer than it should have. She thought about Wren's point, about the quiet, about how safe it had felt, how she'd told herself every single day for 4 years that distance was the same thing as protection. She had never once considered that distance from Damian might also have meant distance from whatever protection his name and his power actually provided. She had been so certain she was running towards safety. It had never once occurred to her she might have been running directly into a different kind of danger she didn't have the information to even recognize. "There's something else," Damian said, and something in his tone made the hair on Vivian's arms rise before he even finished the sentence. "Something you need to know before we leave this diner. Something about why I came myself today instead of sending Reyes's team to simply confirm you were alive and report back." Vivian's stomach tightened. "What?" 3 weeks ago, one of my men intercepted a transaction. Damian's voice had dropped into something flat and professional. The voice she imagined he used in rooms she'd never been allowed into. "A buyer paying for information on the location of a woman matching your description, traveling with 2 young children in the Pacific Northwest. The buyer wasn't one of mine. The buyer wasn't connected to any operation I run." He paused, and his eyes, when they met hers again, were dead serious in a way that made the diner around them feel suddenly very small and very exposed. "The buyer was connected to a man named Sergei Markov. You might not know that name. You should. Sergei Markov has wanted me dead for 6 years, ever since I refused to let him run product through territory my father built. And the fastest way to destroy a man like me isn't to come at me directly. It's to come at the people I can't afford to lose." Vivian felt the blood drain entirely out of her face. "You're telling me somebody else was looking for us before you found us?" "I'm telling you, somebody else found you 3 weeks before I did," Damian said. "And the only reason you and those boys are sitting in a diner right now instead of somewhere far worse is that my people intercepted the sale before the buyer could act on it. I had less than 72 hours of warning, Vivian. 72 hours between learning a man who wants me dead had located my missing family and getting in a car myself to make sure I reached you before he did." The diner went very quiet in Vivian's ears, the world narrowing down to the cracked vinyl under her hands and the sound of her own heartbeat, too loud, too fast. And outside the window, her 2 sons were laughing at something in the water, completely unaware that for 3 weeks they had been a line item in a transaction between men who would have used them as a weapon against the father they'd never met. "I need you to understand what I'm asking you," Damian said, leaning forward, his voice low and urgent now, all the careful control of the last 20 minutes beginning to fray at the edges. I'm not asking you to forgive me for something I never did. I'm not asking you to forget 4 years of believing the worst about me. I am telling you that the life you built in that town, the safety you thought you found, it's compromised. It has been compromised for 3 weeks and you didn't know it. And I will not walk out of this diner and leave my sons in a town with no security, no protection, and a target on them that I only just barely managed to remove. So what? Vivian's voice came out hoarse, stripped down to something raw. What are you saying? That I have to come back with you? That I don't get a choice in this either? I'm saying you have a choice between two things, and I need you to actually look at both of them instead of running on instinct again. Something in his face hardened, the grief shifting back into something closer to the man she remembered from 2 years of marriage. Capable, controlled, carrying weight most people never had to imagine. You can stay in Wren's Point, and I will leave a security detail there whether you want it or not, because I am not gambling with my sons' lives over your pride. Or you can come to New York, where I can actually guarantee their safety instead of hoping 6 men in 2 cars are enough to stop whatever Markov tries next. Those are the options. There isn't a third one where everybody goes back to a normal life and pretends today never happened. Vivian sat in silence for a long moment, staring down at the sonogram photo between them, soft creased and 4 years carried. The only physical proof remaining of the night her entire understanding of her own life had detonated in a doorway. She thought about Dot at the diner, about the boys' bedroom with the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck crooked on the ceiling, about every careful brick of the small safe life she'd built with her own exhausted hands. And she thought about 3 black SUVs in a grocery store parking lot and a man named Sergei Markov she'd never heard of until 90 seconds ago, who had apparently known exactly where to find her sons before their own father did. "I want to talk to Cassidy," she said finally, her voice low and unsteady. "Before I decide anything, I want to hear it from her, not from you, from her." Something eased very slightly in Damien's shoulders, like he'd been braced for a flat refusal and hadn't gotten one. "That can be arranged." "And I want the truth about something else," Vivian said, and her eyes came up to meet his, hard now, the grief burning off into something closer to fury. "If you've spent 4 years searching for us, if you've had men in every state, why now? Why today? You said Markov found us 3 weeks ago. Did you know where we were before that? Did you have a lead and sit on it?" Damien's jaw tightened, and for the first time since the parking lot, Vivian watched him hesitate. Actually, hesitate. A half-second pause that told her more than anything he could have said next. "I had a lead 8 months ago," he admitted, quiet, like the words cost him something physical to say. "A waitress matching your description, working under a name close enough to yours that my investigator flagged it. Small fishing town, Pacific Northwest." Vivian's whole body went rigid. 8 months. "You knew where I was 8 months ago and you didn't come." "I didn't act on it," he corrected, and there was something almost ashamed in the way he said it, an emotion that looked wrong on a face built for control. "Because I wasn't certain, and because the last time I acted without certainty, I lost 4 years of my children's lives to a misunderstanding that destroyed everything. I sent someone to confirm quietly first. Not to approach, just to confirm. And the report came back inconclusive. Wrong angle on a photograph. A blurry image through a diner window that could have been you or could have been 100 other tired women working an early shift in 100 other small towns. I had analysts argue about it for 6 weeks. His voice had gone tight, almost angry now, though Vivian understood, with a cold lurch in her stomach, that the anger wasn't directed at her. It was directed at himself. 6 weeks, Vivian, while you and my sons lived 15 minutes from a security team I could have had in place in 48 hours, because I was too afraid of being wrong again to act on an instinct that turned out to be exactly right. The diner seemed to tilt slightly under Vivian's hands. 8 months. 8 months he had known, or almost known, or close enough to known, that doubt alone had kept him away. And in that same 8 months, somewhere out in a world she couldn't see, a man named Sergei Markov had been quietly building toward the exact same discovery. Except he hadn't hesitated. He'd acted. He'd paid for the information the second he had it, with no 6 weeks of careful analyst debate standing between intention and action. "You're telling me," Vivian said slowly, each word landing like a stone, That the only reason my sons are alive and sitting on a dock right now instead of God knows where is that your enemy moved faster than you did, and your people happened to catch the transaction in time. Damien didn't flinch from it. That at least she'd give him. He didn't look away, didn't soften it, didn't try to make it smaller than it was. Yes, he said, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And I am going to have to live with how close that came for the rest of my life. The same way you're going to have to live with 4 years built on 5 seconds you never asked me about. We are both going to have to carry something out of this, Vivian. The only question left is whether we carry it in the same direction or apart. Outside the window, Jack had found a crab shell on the dock and was holding it up triumphantly for Reyes to inspect. Noah crouched beside him, examining it with the same careful, watchful focus he brought to everything. Two small boys, utterly unaware that the adults inside the diner had just finished rebuilding and then immediately shattering the entire foundation of the last 4 years in the space of 20 minutes. Vivian pressed both hands flat against the table to stop them shaking and looked at the man across from her. Husband, stranger, the architect of a grief she now understood she had built almost entirely herself, and also, undeniably, the only thing standing between her sons and a man who had already paid once to find them. I need to go back to Wren's Point, she said finally. I need to pack our things. I need to tell Dot something, anything, that isn't the full truth, because she's been the only family I've had for 4 years, and she doesn't deserve to find out from a stranger that everything I told her about my life was a lie. Her voice cracked again, but she pushed through it. And then I need you to understand something, Damien, before any of us gets in a car going anywhere. I am not doing this because I forgive you. I don't know if I forgive you. I don't know if 4 years comes undone over pancakes and a folded photograph, no matter how long you carried it. I am doing this because 3 black SUVs and a stranger's photograph through a diner window have made it very clear that I do not actually have the luxury of staying angry at you while my sons are in danger. That's the only reason. Don't mistake it for anything else. Damien held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind those pale gray eyes that belonged, unmistakably, to the 2 boys laughing on the dock outside. I understand exactly what this is, he said quietly, and I am not going to pretend I expect more than that right now. But I want you to know one more thing before we leave this booth, and I need you to actually hear it instead of bracing against it. What? Markov isn't finished. His voice had gone low and grim, stripped of everything except the cold, professional certainty of a man laying out a threat he understood better than anyone alive. Intercepting one transaction doesn't end a 6-year war. It tells him I know where you are now, which means it tells him exactly where to look the next time he wants to hurt me. The moment we leave this town together, Vivian, we are not walking away from danger. We're walking directly into the part of my life I spent 4 years hoping my children would never have to know existed. He paused, and something flickered behind his eyes that looked, for just a moment, almost like fear. And there's no clean way out of it left. Not anymore. Not for any of us. Vivian looked past him, out the window, at her sons crouched together over a dead crab on a weathered dock, laughing at something only the 2 of them found funny, utterly unaware that somewhere beyond the edges of that small, ordinary moment, a war neither of them had asked for was already closing in around the only family they had ever known. And she understood, with a cold, sinking certainty that settled into her chest like a stone, that whatever choice she made in the next 60 seconds, there was no version of it left where any of them got to go back to before. They left Wren's Point 4 hours later, and Vivian would remember almost nothing about the packing itself except the specific surgical pain of folding 2 small t-shirts into a duffel bag while Dot stood in the doorway of the rented house with her arms crossed and her eyes wet and furious. You don't owe me the whole truth, Dot had said, voice rough. But you owe me more than it's complicated, Vivian. 3 years. 3 years and I find out you've got a name that isn't your name from a man who climbed out of an SUV like he owns the state. I know. Vivian hadn't been able to look up from the duffel bag. I know, Dot. I'm sorry. I'll explain everything I can, when I can. I promise you that. Right now, I just need to get my boys somewhere safe, and I need you to trust me on that the same way you trusted me 3 years ago when I showed up here with nothing and a baby bump. And you hired me anyway without asking a single hard question. Dot had been quiet a long moment, jaw working, and then she'd crossed the room and pulled Vivian into a hug so fierce it nearly cracked a rib. You call me, she said into Vivian's hair. Every week, you hear me? Every week, or I am driving to whatever fortress that man keeps you in, and I am bringing a shotgun. It was the only thing that made Vivian laugh that whole day, watery and brief. And then it was over, and the truck, her own beat-up 10-year-old truck, got left behind in Dot's driveway because Damien's people said it wasn't safe to track and Vivian was too exhausted to fight that particular battle. And 4 hours later, she was strapped into the back of a private plane with her sons asleep against her on either side, watching the lights of Oregon shrink and disappear beneath the wing, flying back into the exact life she had crossed a country to escape. Damien sat across the narrow aisle the entire flight, working through something on a tablet with Reyes murmuring updates at his shoulder every 20 minutes, low and clipped, words Vivian half caught and didn't like the shape of. Markov. Asset. Compromised. She didn't ask. She told herself she didn't have the strength left to ask, but the truth was closer to the fact that some part of her was afraid of what the answer would cost her, on a night when she'd already spent every reserve of strength she had. Just getting her sons onto a plane without either of them asking too many questions she didn't have safe answers for. They landed at a private airfield outside the city a little after midnight. A different convoy of black vehicles was waiting on the tarmac, and this time Vivian didn't flinch at the sight of them the way she had in the grocery store parking lot. 4 years of fear had already started, in the space of a single day, to harden into something closer to a grim, exhausted acceptance. And she hated herself a little for how quickly that had happened. The mansion sat on a cliff above the water, somewhere north of the city Vivian didn't recognize, and even half asleep with Noah heavy in her arms and Jack stumbling along beside her clutching her coat. She registered the scale of it. Stone and glass and a security gate that took 4 separate checks to clear. Men with earpieces stationed at intervals along a drive so long it had its own lighting system. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built by someone who had never once in his life stopped expecting an attack. A woman met them at the door. Mid-50s, gray-streaked hair pulled back severe, dressed in dark slacks and a blouse despite the hour, with the particular bearing of someone who had run this house for a very long time and answered to exactly one person in it. "This is Marta," Damien said. She'll show you to the boys' rooms. They're next to yours, connecting door. No locks on the inside if you want them open. He paused, something flickering across his tired face. "I had them prepared 8 months ago, when I had the first lead." Vivian didn't know what to do with that information, so she said nothing, and let Marta lead her up a wide staircase to 2 rooms that had clearly been waiting, furnished and ready, for 4 years' worth of imagined homecoming that had nearly never happened. Small beds with rocket ship sheets, a shelf of books that looked untouched, a single stuffed gray wolf sitting upright on each pillow with tags still on. She put the boys down without waking either of them fully, peeled off their shoes, and stood in the doorway between the 2 rooms for a long time after Marta had gone, just breathing, watching her sons sleep in a house built by their father's enemy's worst nightmare, and not feeling safe even slightly. She found Damien in the study an hour later. She hadn't meant to go looking for him. She'd told herself she was just walking the house to settle her own nerves before trying to sleep in an unfamiliar bed. But her feet had carried her there anyway, down a long hallway she half recognized from 4 years and a different lifetime ago. And she stood in the doorway for a moment before he noticed her, watching him sit behind a desk that wasn't the one she remembered. A newer one. Dark wood instead of the pale oak that used to sit there. "You replaced the desk," she said. He looked up, startled, then composed. "I told you I would. You said it because you couldn't look at the stain anymore. I thought that meant you got rid of it right after I left." She stepped into the room, arms crossed over her chest, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the house. 8 months, Damien. You had 8 months of a lead, and you sat on it for 6 weeks arguing with analysts about a blurry photograph. I need you to actually explain that to me, because the version you gave me in the diner doesn't sit right. Not anymore. Not now that I've had 4 hours on a plane to think about it. Something shifted behind his eyes. Wary, careful. "I told you the truth. You told me a version of the truth." Vivian's voice had an edge to it now, sharpened by exhaustion, and the particular clarity that comes after the adrenaline of a long day finally starts to burn off. "A man like you doesn't sit on a lead for 6 weeks because of a blurry photograph. I lived 2 years inside your decision-making, Damien. I watched you make calls that moved millions of dollars in under 5 minutes, because you trusted your own instincts more than anyone else's analysis. So don't sit there and tell me that the only reason you didn't come for your own children 8 months ago was because a picture was out of focus. He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Vivian felt something cold creeping up her spine. The particular dread of a person who has just realized they were right to be suspicious. "There's something you don't know," he said finally, and set down the tablet he'd been holding with deliberate care, like a man buying himself time. "About why the lead sat for 6 weeks. Tell me." It wasn't an analyst call. His jaw tightened. It was Cassidy's. The room went very still. Vivian felt her pulse pick up, slow and heavy, dread crawling through her chest like something physical. "What does that mean?" "It means the photograph came from a contact of hers, a friend from her recovery program who'd relocated to the Pacific Northwest a year earlier, who happened to mention a waitress in a small coastal town with 2 boys who didn't look like their mother. Cassidy heard about it secondhand through this friend months before it ever reached me." Damien's voice had gone careful, measured, the voice of a man laying out facts he knew were going to detonate. "She sat on it. For 6 weeks. Before she finally brought it to me." Vivian's hands had curled into fists at her sides without her noticing. "Why?" "Because she was afraid." His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching, though something underneath the steadiness looked almost sick. "Because she knew that the second she told me, I would act on it, and she was terrified of what would happen when you found out the full truth about that night. Not because the truth made her guilty of an affair, Vivian, but because there's a part of the truth I haven't told you yet, a part that's harder. Tell me right now." Vivian's voice had dropped to something low and dangerous, every protective instinct she had narrowing into a single, sharp point. "Tell me everything, Damien, or so help me I will take my sons and find a way out of this house tonight. Security or no security, Markov or no Markov." He exhaled, long and rough, and for the first time since the grocery store parking lot, Vivian watched something that looked almost like shame settle over his face. "The loan sharks who beat your sister," he said. "They didn't come after her over a random debt that fell out of nowhere. Cassidy's habit, the one I told you about in the diner, she didn't fall into it on her own. She was introduced to it, deliberately, by someone working for Markov, who'd identified her as the easiest way into my life that didn't involve trying to kill me directly. They got her hooked, ran up a debt specifically designed to be unpayable, and then they used the threat of hurting her to try to extract information about my operations. She came to me that night bleeding because she'd refused to give them what they wanted. She protected me, Vivian. Your sister took a beating that night to keep me safe, and the entire mess you walked in on was the result of an enemy using her as a weapon against our family. The same enemy who is sitting outside this house right now. The same enemy who found you and the boys 3 weeks before I did." Vivian felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. "You're telling me Markov did this? All of it? The night I left? The 4 years apart? All of it traces back to him?" "Yes." Damien's voice had gone flat, grim. "And there's more. The reason I sat on the lead for 6 weeks, the real reason, it wasn't caution about a blurry photograph. It was because the same week Cassidy brought it to me, we discovered that the leak that let Markov's people identify your sister as a target in the first place came from inside this house. Someone close to me. Someone who had access to information only a handful of people were ever given." His eyes held hers, hard now, the grim weight of a man delivering a wound he knew he couldn't soften. "It took 6 weeks to find out who. And once I did, I had to make a decision about whether moving on the lead in Oregon would tip my hand to the person responsible before I was ready to act." "Who?" Vivian said, barely above a whisper, though something in her chest had already started to guess, already started to dread the shape of the answer before he gave it to her. Damien's expression hardened into something Vivian had only seen once before, in the half-second before he'd reached for Cassidy on that desk 4 years ago. "Reyes," he said. Vivian's breath caught. "The man who... He's been with you this whole day. He was with my sons on the dock. He's been with me for 6 years. He was my father's man before he was mine. I trusted him with everything." Damien's hands had curled into fists on the desk, knuckles white. "We confirmed it 11 days ago. Financial records, a pattern of contact, a paper trail his own arrogance left behind because he never imagined I'd actually look. He's been feeding information to Markov's people for the better part of a year. Your location, once we finally narrowed it down. The exact town. The diner. The boys' daycare. All of it, sitting in a file he handed off 3 weeks ago, which is the transaction we intercepted, except... He stopped. Except what? Vivian's voice had gone razor thin. Damien, except what? Except we don't know if we intercepted the only copy. His jaw worked, the words coming out like they cost him something physical to say. We confirmed Reyes sold your location. We confirmed and stopped one transaction, but we never confirmed it was the only one he made. And tonight, 2 hours before we landed, my security team flagged unusual activity on the perimeter cameras of this house. Movement in the tree line on the north slope. Gone before anyone could get eyes on it directly. His gray eyes, so much like his son's, found hers across the desk, and what she saw there wasn't the cold control she remembered from 2 years of marriage. It was fear, raw and unguarded. The fear of a man who understood exactly how much he stood to lose and exactly how little control he actually had over losing it. And Reyes is still here. Vivian's voice had gone hoarse with disbelief. He's still in this house. He was with my sons tonight. He walked them through this hallway to their rooms. I haven't moved on him yet. Damien's voice had dropped to something cold and surgical, a register Vivian recognized now as the version of him that made other men go quiet in rooms. Because the moment I move on him, whoever he's working with knows we know. And right now the only advantage I have left is that Markov's people don't realize their inside source is about to be cut off. I need another 48 hours to trace exactly how deep this goes before I act, and I need you and the boys somewhere he doesn't have access to in the meantime. 48 hours. Vivian's whole body had begun to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor she couldn't will away. You're telling me that the man who tucked my children into a car seat today, who showed them where to find boats, who you let walk them down a hallway alone 20 minutes ago, that man has been selling our location to people who want to hurt us, and your plan is to wait 2 more days before you do anything about it. My plan is to make sure that when I act, I cut off every thread, not just the one I can see. Damien stood, came around the desk, stopped a careful distance away like he understood he had no right to close it further. If I move on Reyes tonight, and there's a second buyer out there I don't know about, someone he already sold the information to before we caught the first sale, then tonight changes nothing except tipping Markov off that his assets been burned. I need to know who else has this information before I start cutting threads, or I am protecting you from one danger by creating 3 more I can't see coming. Vivian stared at him, and something inside her, something that had been holding on by threadbare will since the parking lot, since the diner, since the entire devastating unraveling of the last 16 hours, finally snapped clean through. You knew this when you put my children in a car with him, she said, voice shaking with a fury that had nowhere safe to land. You knew he might be compromised, and you let him ride with my sons anyway. I confirmed it 11 days ago, Vivian, not 11 hours. I've had a security plan running around him for almost 2 weeks, specifically so that he is never alone with information that matters, never alone with decisions that matter. He was alone with my children on a dock. Her voice cracked across the study, loud enough that Damien actually flinched, loud enough that somewhere down the hall a door opened and closed softly. Marta checking on the noise and retreating when she understood what kind of conversation this was. You let a man who sold us out for money stand 15 feet from my sons today, and you didn't say one word to me about it. You let me sit in that diner thinking the only thing I had to be afraid of was Markov, when the entire time the danger was standing at the door pretending to babysit. He wasn't going to hurt them today. Damien's voice had risen too now, the careful control finally cracking under the weight of everything. 4 years and 16 hours in a betrayal, 11 days deep, all coming apart in his own study at 1 in the morning. A man like Reyes doesn't act without a buyer lined up and a payment confirmed. And he had neither today, which is exactly why I made the call to let the day play out the way it did, instead of blowing the whole operation apart in a grocery store parking lot in front of your sons. I made a tactical decision, Vivian, the same kind of tactical decision I have been making every single day for 4 years to keep this family alive. And I am not going to apologize for the fact that those decisions are not always clean. Tactical. Vivian's laugh came out broken, disbelieving. You're calling my children's safety a tactical decision. I am calling the difference between losing you both permanently and losing you for 1 more day a tactical decision, yes. His voice had gone hard, almost cruel, though Vivian could see underneath it the particular brittleness of a man holding himself together by main force. Because that is the actual world we live in now, whether you want to accept it or not. There is no version of tonight where everything is safe and clean and nobody has to make an impossible call. I have been making impossible calls since before you walked back into that parking lot today, and I will keep making them, because the alternative is losing the only thing I have left to lose. The room had gone silent except for both of their ragged breathing, and Vivian became aware, distantly, of her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs hard enough to hurt, of her hands shaking at her sides, of 4 years of careful, hard-won self-sufficiency screaming at her that she had made an enormous mistake getting on that plane. A sound cut through the silence then, sharp, electronic, Damien's phone buzzing against the desk with an urgency that made him cross the room in 2 strides before the second ring finished. Vivian watched his face change as he read whatever had come through, watched the blood leave it in real time, watched 4 years of careful control collapse into something that looked, for the first time since she'd known him, genuinely and completely afraid. "What?" she said. "Damien, what is it?" He didn't answer right away. He was already moving, already barking something low and fast into the phone, already crossing toward the study door with a speed that made every nerve in Vivian's body go electric with alarm. "Damien," she grabbed his arm hard, forced him to look at her. "Tell me right now." "The North Slope cameras." His voice had gone flat, stripped of everything except cold, professional dread. "The movement we flagged 2 hours ago, it wasn't a scout." He pulled his arm free, already moving again, and over his shoulder, in a voice gone rough with something Vivian had never once heard from him in 2 years of marriage, he said the words that turned the floor beneath her feet into something liquid and unsteady. "They're already inside the perimeter, and Reyes isn't answering his radio." Vivian didn't remember deciding to run. She just found herself moving, bare feet slapping against marble, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth, racing down the long hallway toward the staircase, toward the rooms where her sons were sleeping under rocket ship sheets with stuffed wolves on their pillows, completely unaware that somewhere on the dark grounds below them, the war their father had spent 4 years trying to keep at arm's length had finally, completely, irrevocably arrived at the door. She hit the top of the stairs at a dead run and nearly collided with Marta coming the other way, the older woman's face white and tight in the dim hall light, already speaking before Vivian could ask, words tumbling out fast and urgent. "The boys' room," Marta said. "The connecting door. It's open, and I just checked it 10 minutes ago. And I know I closed it, Vivian. I know I closed it." Vivian didn't wait to hear the rest. She was already moving, already screaming her sons' names into the dark of the upstairs hallway, already shoving through a door that should have been latched and wasn't, into a room where 2 small beds sat empty, sheets thrown back, stuffed wolves fallen to the floor, and the window that had been locked, that Marta had checked, that should have been impossible to open from the outside of a fortress built specifically to keep danger out, stood wide open to the cold black night, curtains lifting and falling in a wind that smelled, faintly, unmistakably, of the sea cliff far below. The scream that came out of Vivian didn't sound like her own voice. It tore out of her chest raw and animal, Jack's name and Noah's name colliding into something that wasn't words anymore, and she was already at the open window before her brain caught up with her body, hands gripping the frame, leaning out into cold salt air that hit her face like a slap. Below, the cliffside grounds dropped away in dark terraces toward the water, security lights strung along a path that wound down through scrub pine toward a boathouse she'd noticed earlier and not thought twice about. And there, 30 yards out, moving fast along that lit path, 2 small shapes, one being half carried, half dragged by a much larger figure in dark clothing, and a second man behind him scanning the tree line with something held low and ready in both hands. "Noah!" The name ripped out of her again, and this time one of the small shapes turned just for a second, just long enough for Vivian to see the white blur of a 5-year-old's terrified face turned up toward the house before a gloved hand clamped down over it and yanked him forward. Behind her, footsteps thundered into the room. Damien, Marta on his heels, and Damien didn't stop to look at the window, didn't ask questions, just saw Vivian's face and understood everything he needed to in under a second. "Where?" he said, already moving for the door. "The path." The boathouse path. Two men. They've got both of them. Vivian's voice broke apart entirely, and she didn't care. Was already climbing out onto the narrow stone ledge below the window because the stairs felt like miles, and her sons were getting further away with every second she wasted finding a door. Vivian, no! Damien's hand closed around her wrist, hard, and for one wild second she nearly fought him, nearly bit and clawed to get free, before some shred of sense cut through the animal panic. And she understood he wasn't stopping her. He was pulling her back inside toward a different door, a service stair that cut down through the house faster than the window ledge ever could. This way. It's faster. I know this house. Trust me. His voice had gone into a register she'd never heard, stripped of every careful, controlled thing she'd ever known about him. Nothing left but pure animal urgency, and she ran with him because there was no other choice left. Down a narrow stone stairwell 2 steps at a time, her bare feet slapping cold stone, lungs burning. Damien shouting something into a radio clipped at his collar that she only half registered through the roar of her own pulse in her ears. They burst out a side door into the night, and the cold hit Vivian like a wall, salt wind whipping her hair across her face, and below them, down the terrace slope, she could see the security lights along the boathouse path flickering. Not failing, she realized with a sick lurch, but being shot out, one by one, someone systematically blinding the cameras and the lights as they went. And for a half second of pure blinding terror, Vivian thought she'd lost them completely in the sudden dark. Then she heard it. Jack's voice, high and furious, cutting through the wind. Let go of me! This way. Damien's hand found hers in the dark, gripping hard enough to bruise, and they were running again, down a steep gravel path, branches whipping at Vivian's bare arms, her lungs screaming, every cell in her body narrowed down to one single point of focus. The sound of her son's voice getting closer. They came around a bend in the path, and Vivian's whole body locked up at what she saw. 20 feet ahead, in the wash of one remaining security light, 2 men stood with their backs to the boathouse, one holding Noah pinned against his chest with a hand clamped over the boy's mouth, the small body rigid with terror, and the other gripping Jack by the back of his shirt while the boy thrashed and kicked and screamed with a ferocity that made something in Vivian's chest crack wide open, with a horrible, fierce pride even in the middle of the worst moment of her life. And past them, at the edge of the dock, a third figure stood at the wheel of a small boat, engine already idling low in the water, waiting. Stop! Damien's voice cracked across the clearing like a gunshot, and both men froze. The one holding Jack turning his head enough that Vivian caught the side of his face in the security light and felt her stomach drop through the earth. It was Reyes. Don't come any closer. Reyes's voice had none of the warm, easy tone he'd used with the boys at the diner. Nothing left of the man who'd crouched down to Jack's eye level and offered to show him boats. This was someone else entirely, cold and flat, a stranger wearing a familiar face. I will put him in the water, Damien. I have done worse for less money than what's waiting on the other side of this. You're selling 4-year-old boys to Markov. Damien's voice had gone low and lethal. Every step he took toward the dock slow and deliberate, hands raised slightly at his sides in the universal posture of a man trying not to spook something dangerous. 6 years, Reyes. 6 years I trusted you with everything. My father trusted you before me. And this is what you do with it. Your father is dead and your world is dying with him, piece by piece, and I am tired of going down with a ship that's already taking on water. Reyes's grip on Jack's shirt tightened, and the boy let out a sharp, frightened cry that hit Vivian like a physical blow, every maternal instinct in her body screaming to close the distance, to do something, anything, while some last shred of survival sense kept her rooted exactly where she was, because she understood with terrible clarity that one wrong move here didn't just risk her own life. Markov's paying enough for these two that I never have to look over my shoulder again. You should understand that better than anyone, Damien. You do the same thing in my position. I would never sell a child. Damien's voice shook with a fury so total it had gone almost calm, the particular stillness of a man who has stopped weighing options and started simply waiting for an opening. Not for any amount of money on this earth. That's because you've never been broke enough to need to. Reyes's eyes flicked toward Vivian, standing frozen at the edge of the clearing, and something in his expression shifted, calculating. Mrs. Volkov, you should sit this one out. Your boy here's already had a long night. He doesn't need his mother making it worse by doing something stupid. Let him go. The words came out of Vivian in a voice she didn't recognize, low and shaking and absolutely without fear. Every ounce of exhaustion and grief and 4 years of careful survival distilled down into a single razor-sharp point of fury. I have run from one nightmare for 4 years, and I am done running. Do you understand me? I am done. You put my son down right now, or I swear to every part of me that's left, I will make whatever happens to you next look like mercy. Something in Reyes's face flickered. Not fear, not quite, but a recalculation, the look of a man who'd expected a frightened woman to freeze and was instead watching her come apart into something far more dangerous. The second man, the one holding Noah, shifted his weight, glancing toward the boat, toward the idling engine, toward the narrowing window of opportunity that every second of this standoff was eating away. "We need to move," he said low, urgent, to Reyes. "Now. The longer we stand here, the more chance his security finds the breach we cut. Then let's move." Reyes started backing toward the dock, dragging Jack with him, and the boy's scream went up high and sharp. And Vivian's body moved before her mind caught up with it, lunging forward across the gravel, and Damien's arm shot out and caught her hard across the chest, holding her back with a strength that felt, in that one terrible second, like the only thing standing between her and total catastrophe. "You'll get him killed!" Damien hissed against her ear, low and fast. "Vivian, listen to me. You charge that dock and he panics and drops your son in black water at midnight with a current running, and I cannot get to him fast enough to save him. Do you understand me? I need you to trust me for 30 more seconds. I am not losing my son to your mistakes." The words tore out of her, raw and accusing, 4 years of fear and one devastating night colliding into something almost unrecognizable as grief, more like rage with nowhere left to go. "You knew he was compromised. You let him near my children anyway. This is on you, Damien. Every second of this is on you." "I know." His voice cracked, just once, just enough that she heard the full weight of it underneath the control. "I know it's on me. I will spend the rest of my life knowing it's on me. But right now, this second, the only thing that matters is getting them back alive. And I need you to hold for 30 seconds while my men close the perimeter. Because if you run at that dock right now, you don't save him. You get him killed faster." Vivian's whole body shook with the effort of holding still, every maternal instinct in her screaming a single word over and over, "Go, go, go," while some last cold, clear part of her brain understood, hated understanding, that he was right. On the dock, Reyes had reached the boat, was passing Jack down to the third man waiting in it, the boy's small body thrashing against hands far stronger than his own, and Vivian watched her son's face turn toward her across 30 feet of dark gravel and water, eyes wide and wet and terrified, mouth shaping her name even with a hand clamped over it, and something inside her chest simply tore in half. "No." The word came out of her in a register that didn't sound human anymore, and she felt Damien's arm tighten around her, holding her back with everything he had, his own breath ragged and broken against her ear. "Reyes." Damien's voice had changed again, gone suddenly and completely calm. A stillness so total it cut through even the chaos of the clearing, and Vivian felt him release her, just slightly, stepping forward with both hands visible, empty, raised. "You want money. I understand that. I'm going to give you a number right now, and I want you to actually listen to it before you get in that boat." Reyes paused, one hand still on the boat's rail, eyes narrowed with the particular wariness of a man who'd worked for Damien Volkov long enough to know that calm voice was usually the most dangerous one. "I'm listening. Whatever Markov's paying you, I'll triple it." Damien's voice didn't waver, didn't shake, every word landing flat and certain in the cold night air. "Wired tonight, untraceable, the second my sons are standing back on this dock with their mother. And you walk away. Not just from tonight, from everything. New name, new country, enough money that you never have to look over your shoulder for me or for Markov for the rest of your life. That's the offer. Take it now, or I promise you, the moment that boat pulls away from this dock with my children on it, I will spend every resource I have left in this world, making sure you do not survive the week, no matter what Markov pays you to disappear." The clearing went very still except for the low idle of the boat engine and the wind off the water and Jack's muffled, furious crying, and Vivian watched Rhea's face in the dim remaining light, watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the particular arithmetic of a desperate man weighing a guaranteed threat against a promised reward, and for 3 full seconds she didn't breathe at all. "Triple," Reyes said finally, slow, testing the word. "Triple. Tonight. And you walk." Damien hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, every line of his body radiating a certainty that Vivian, even now, even hating him for the 11 days he'd sat on a name he should have given her immediately, found herself desperately needing to believe. Reyes's eyes flicked to the third man in the boat, some silent communication passing between them, and then, with a motion that seemed to take an eternity and happened in under 2 seconds, he reached down and lifted Jack back up out of the boat onto the dock, setting him down hard enough that the boy stumbled and released the hand from his mouth. "Jack!" Vivian was moving before she'd decided to, sprinting across the gravel, and this time nobody held her back, and she hit the dock at a dead run and scooped her son up off his feet, his small arms locking around her neck so hard it hurt, his whole body shaking with sobs that he'd clearly been holding in through sheer terrified willpower for the last unbearable minutes. Mom, they had Noah. They had Noah in the boat." "I know, baby. I know. I've got you. Vivian's voice broke apart completely, pressing her face into her son's hair, breathing him in, feeling his heartbeat hammering against her own chest. And over his shoulder she watched the second man, the one still holding Noah, hesitate, look toward Reyes for instruction, and Reyes, who had just taken a deal, who had just agreed to walk away, gave a single, small shake of his head. "Reyes!" Damien's voice had gone cold again, instant, the temperature of the entire clearing dropping 10 degrees in the space of one word. "We had a deal. We had a deal for one of them." Reyes's voice had gone strange, almost apologetic, almost, and this was the part that made ice settle into Vivian's stomach, almost regretful. "Markov's not paying for one kid, Damien. He's paying for proof. He needs something to hold over you that actually means something, and letting both of them go means I walk into whatever's left of my life with nothing but your money, and a man like Markov, who doesn't forgive people who renegotiate his deals without permission. Then you're a dead man either way." Damien's voice had gone flat, final, every trace of negotiation gone from it. "You understand that, don't you? The second you get in that boat with my son, it doesn't matter what Markov pays you. It doesn't matter what country you run to. I will spend every breath I have left finding you, and there will not be a triple offer waiting at the end of it. Maybe." Reyes was already backing toward the boat, the third man hauling Noah further into it, the boy's small body rigid with terror, eyes huge and fixed on Vivian across the widening gap of water and gravel. "But I'll have a head start, and a payday big enough to disappear properly this time, and that's better odds than I had standing in this clearing with nothing." "Noah!" Vivian's scream tore out of her raw and absolute, Jack still clutched against her chest, and she watched the boat's engine rev up from an idle into something louder, more urgent, the third man already reaching for the wheel, Reyes vaulting over the side onto the deck with the easy, practiced motion of a man who had done far worse things than this in far worse circumstances. Damien moved. It happened too fast for Vivian to fully track. 1 second he was standing beside her on the dock, and the next he was a blur of motion, closing the distance to the boat in a handful of strides that shouldn't have been physically possible, and he hit the edge of the dock and launched himself across the widening gap of black water with a violence that made Vivian's heart stop entirely, watching her husband's body collide with the side of the boat, one hand catching the rail, the whole vessel rocking hard enough that for one horrifying second she thought it would capsize with her son still inside it. "Damien!" The third man spun from the wheel, something in his hand catching the last edge of dock light. Metal, dark, unmistakable. And Vivian's scream went up into the night air as a sound cracked across the water, sharp and flat and final. And for one suspended, terrible moment, everything in the clearing went absolutely silent except for the idle of the boat's engine and the lap of black water against the hull and the high, thin sound of her own breath catching somewhere it couldn't seem to get past. Watching the dark shape of her husband's body go still against the rail of a boat carrying her son out into the cold and the dark, with no way left to tell, in that frozen, airless second, whether he was still moving at all. The body on the boat's rail moved. It moved before Vivian's mind had even finished processing the gunshot, before her scream had finished tearing out of her throat, And what she watched happen next would stay lodged behind her eyes for the rest of her life. Damien, who she had thought for one suspended, airless second, was dead in the water, rolling off the rail and driving his shoulder into the third man's knees with a violence that took the gun out of play entirely, both of them going down hard onto the boat's deck in a tangle of limbs. The shot had gone wide. She understood that a half-second later, the way the boat rocked, the way Reyes was shouting something furious and panicked, and the relief that flooded through her was so total it nearly buckled her knees right there on the dock, Jack still locked around her neck, both of them shaking. "Noah! Get down, baby! Get down low!" Vivian screamed it across the water, and through some miracle of a 5-year-old's terror-sharpened instincts, she watched her son drop flat against the deckboards, small hands clamped over his ears, exactly as the boat's engine cut out. Someone, somewhere, had killed the throttle, and the whole vessel went dead still in the black water, drifting now instead of fleeing. On the deck, Damien had the third man pinned, one knee driven into his back, both of the man's wrists wrenched up behind him in a hold that looked practiced and brutal and absolutely without mercy. And Reyes stood frozen 3 feet away with his hands half raised, caught between the gun he'd dropped somewhere in the scramble and the sudden screaming arrival of 4 more men in dark jackets pounding down the dock behind Vivian, Damien's security finally closing the perimeter that had taken every one of those unbearable 30 seconds to reach them. "Don't move." One of the new arrivals had a weapon trained on Reyes before the man could so much as flinch toward the water. "Don't you move." Reyes didn't move. Something had gone out of him, Vivian saw, some last reserve of nerve or greed that had carried him this far finally spent, and he stood there on the dock with his hands raised and his head down. A man who'd spent 6 years building trust and burned all of it in a single night for a payday he was never going to live to enjoy. Vivian didn't wait for permission. She set Jack down with a hand pressed hard to his shoulder. "Stay, baby, stay right there. I need you to stay." And ran the length of the dock to where the boat had drifted close enough that one of Damien's men was already hauling it in by a line. And she didn't think, didn't calculate, just stepped off the edge of the dock onto the rocking deck and dropped to her knees beside her younger son, gathering him up against her chest with a force that probably hurt them both. And Noah, silent, watchful. Noah, who never made much noise even when he was frightened, finally broke, sobbing into her shoulder in great gulping breaths that shook his whole small body. "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you both. I'm not letting go. I promise I'm never letting go again." Behind her, Damien hauled the third man up by the collar and shoved him toward his own men, breathing hard, blood running from a split lip down his chin, one eye already starting to swell. And for a moment he just stood there on the rocking deck of a stolen boat in the middle of the night, chest heaving, staring at his wife wrapped around both of his sons, like a man who couldn't quite believe what he was looking at. "Get them inside," he said finally, voice raw. "Both of them. Marta has the medical kit. Get them checked. Get them warm." His eyes found Vivian's over the boys' heads, and something passed between them in that look that didn't have words yet, wouldn't have words for hours, maybe days. "I need to deal with this. I'll be right behind you." She didn't argue. She carried Noah off the boat herself, Jack pressed against her side the whole way up the gravel path, and didn't look back once, because she understood with a clarity that felt like the only clean thing left in her after a night like this, that whatever happened to Reyes and the man from the boat in the next several minutes was not something her sons needed to carry with them for the rest of their lives. Some things a mother simply absorbed so her children wouldn't have to. It was nearly 4 in the morning before the house went quiet again. Both boys bathed and fed warm milk, and finally, mercifully, asleep in Vivian's own bed, because neither of them could be convinced to sleep anywhere else that night, their small bodies curled on either side of her like they'd done when they were infants, like some animal part of them needed the proof of her heartbeat to believe the night was actually over. Vivian didn't sleep. She lay between her sons in the dark, watching the slow rise and fall of their breathing, and somewhere around 4:30 she heard the soft knock on the door and knew, without having to ask, who it was. Damien stood in the hallway with a butterfly bandage over the cut on his lip and a fresh bruise darkening along his cheekbone, still in the same clothes from the dock, salt stiff and dark with water at the cuffs. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there, looking past her at the 2 small shapes asleep in the bed, and something in his face was so raw, so completely unguarded, that Vivian felt the last of her anger toward him soften into something more complicated, something closer to grief shared rather than grief inflicted. "Reyes is in custody," he said quietly. "Not police custody. My custody for now, until I decide what happens next. The other one's talking. Markov sent 3 men total, the 2 on the dock, and a third who never made it past the tree line before my perimeter team found him. We have names now, locations, more than we've had in 6 years of this." He paused, swallowed. "It's not over tonight, Vivian. I won't lie to you and tell you it is. But it's the first real crack in something that's been hunting this family longer than you've even known to be afraid of it." "I know." Vivian eased herself carefully off the bed, tucking the blanket higher around both boys, and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door nearly closed behind her so their voices wouldn't carry. "I watched you almost die for them tonight. I watched you jump onto a moving boat with a gun pointed at you, and I keep waiting to feel angrier about all of it, about Reyes, about the 8 months, about every piece of this that you should have told me sooner, and I can't find the anger anymore. I think I used all of it up on the dock." Damien's jaw worked, and for a moment he looked younger than she'd ever seen him, stripped down to something almost boyish in its uncertainty. "I should have told you about Reyes the second we confirmed it. I made a calculation that protecting the investigation mattered more than protecting your trust in me, and I was wrong. I understand that now in a way I didn't understand it 11 days ago, standing in a briefing room looking at financial records instead of standing in a parking lot looking at my sons' faces." He exhaled, long and unsteady. "I have spent 4 years telling myself that if I ever found you again, I would never make another decision that put caution ahead of honesty with you. And then the first real test came, and I failed it anyway, because some old part of me still thinks control is the same thing as protection." "It isn't," Vivian said, quiet but certain. "I learned that the hard way too, Damien. I thought running was the same thing as protecting them. I thought distance was the same thing as safety. I built 4 years on that belief, and tonight a boat with a stranger at the wheel taught me how wrong I was. We're not so different, you and me. We both default to handling things alone instead of trusting the other person enough to handle them together." He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked almost like hope, fragile and unpracticed. "Is there a together left to trust? After everything?" Vivian didn't answer right away. She leaned back against the hallway wall, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was, bone deep. The particular exhaustion that comes after the adrenaline finally burns all the way through and leaves nothing behind but the raw, shaking truth of how close everything had come to being lost. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I know I don't hate you the way I did this morning. I know that what I believed for 4 years was wrong, and I know that's not a small thing to carry. Finding out the worst story of your life was a lie you told yourself out of fear instead of evidence. I know my sons could have died tonight because of decisions made on both sides of this. Yours, about Reyes, and mine, about ever thinking I could outrun something this big alone. I don't have room left tonight for anything more complicated than that. But I'm still here. I didn't get back on a plane tonight. That has to count for something." "It does." His voice cracked on the words, and he didn't try to hide it. "It counts for more than you know." They talked until the light outside the windows started to go gray, sitting on the floor of the hallway like 2 people with nowhere else left to be. And somewhere in those slow, careful hours, Vivian finally asked the question she'd been circling for a day and a half without quite landing on it. "I want to see Cassidy," she said. "Today, if it's possible. I need to hear it from her. Not because I doubt what you told me anymore, so I believe you, Damien. I believe all of it. The desk, and the blood, and the loan sharks, and the 18 months sober. I need to hear it from her because she's my sister, and I left her holding 4 years of guilt that was never hers to carry, and I am not going to let one more day go by without telling her that myself." Cassidy arrived at the house just after noon, and Vivian watched her get out of the car from the same upstairs window, where, less than 12 hours earlier, she'd watched 2 strangers drag her sons down toward a waiting boat. Cassidy looked different than the woman in the memory Vivian had carried for 4 years. Leaner, steadier, dressed simply, her dark hair cut shorter and practical, and there was a stillness to the way she moved now that hadn't been there before, the particular calm of someone who had rebuilt themselves from very far down. They met in the garden, away from the house, away from the boys, who were finally outside playing under Marta's careful watch after a morning that had started with both of them refusing to leave Vivian's sight. Cassidy stopped 10 feet away and didn't move closer, hands clasped tight in front of her, eyes already wet. "I don't know where to start," Cassidy said. "Start with the truth," Vivian said. "All of it. I've heard Damien's version. I want yours." So Cassidy told her. The debt that started small and grew teeth. The men who found her outside a pharmacy and made it clear that pretending she didn't owe them money was no longer an option. The night she'd shown up at Damien's office bleeding because she hadn't known anywhere else safer to go, because some animal instinct told her that whatever Damien Volkov was to the rest of the world, he would not let his wife's sister bleed out on a stranger's floor. She told Vivian about the surgery, the recovery, the 18 months of meetings in church basements that smelled like burnt coffee, and the particular loneliness of getting sober while your only sister thought you were a person who destroyed marriages instead of a person who'd nearly died protecting one. "I should have called you that same week," Cassidy said, voice breaking. "I should have found you and made you listen, made you understand what actually happened. But I was scared, Vivian. I was scared you'd hate me either way, for the addiction, for the debt, for bleeding all over Damien's desk and giving you a reason to leave a marriage you were already unsure about for reasons that had nothing to do with me. It was easier to let you believe the worst story." God, that sounds horrible saying it out loud. It was never easier. It just felt easier, in the moment, when I was barely holding myself together. "You let me believe my husband was a monster for 4 years, Vivian said, and there was no anger left in it, just a kind of exhausted grief. "You let me raise your nephews 3,000 miles away thinking their father was a man who'd betray the people who trusted him most." "I know." Cassidy's voice was barely above a whisper. "I have hated myself for that every single day. When the lead came through my friend in Oregon, when I found out where you were, I sat on it for 6 weeks, Vivian, not because I didn't want you found, but because I was terrified of this exact conversation. Terrified of standing in front of you and finally having to say out loud how much my silence cost you." Vivian closed the distance between them slowly, and for a long moment the two sisters just stood there in the cold garden light, looking at each other across 4 years of distance that had never really been about an affair at all. It had been about two women who'd both decided, independently, that silence was safer than the truth, and had both been wrong in ways that had nearly cost them everything. "I'm not going to pretend the last 4 years didn't happen," Vivian said finally. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not angry that you let me carry this alone when one phone call could have changed everything. But I understand fear, Cassidy. I built an entire life out of fear. I'm not in a position to stand here and tell you that you should have been braver than I was." Cassidy made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, raw and relieved. And Vivian finally closed the last few feet between them and pulled her sister into a hug that neither of them had managed in 4 years, holding on hard enough to feel Cassidy's heartbeat against her own chest, both of them crying without any pretense of holding it together. "I have nephews," Cassidy said into her shoulder, voice thick. "I have actual nephews, and I've never even met them." "You're going to meet them today," Vivian said. "And you're going to be honest with them, eventually, when they're old enough, about the fact that the people who love each other most still mess this up sometimes. That's a lesson worth them learning early, I think. Better from us than from finding out the hard way themselves someday." The months that followed didn't erase what had happened. Vivian understood, even in the gentlest of those early weeks, that some things didn't get erased, only carried differently. The house on the cliff changed slowly, room by room, the way a fortress changes when the people inside it stop bracing for attack every hour of every day. Damien dismantled the parts of his world that had nearly cost him everything, piece by deliberate piece. Not overnight, not in some single dramatic gesture, but in the slow, unglamorous work of a man unwinding decades of his father's architecture and rebuilding something his sons could grow up inside without fear shaping every choice they made. The most violent operations went first, then the men who'd run them. Legitimate businesses took their place at the center of things, shipping and property and investments that didn't require armed convoys to protect. And though Vivian understood there would never be a version of this life entirely free of risk, the version that emerged over those months was one she could finally imagine raising her sons inside without flinching. Reyes was dealt with in ways Vivian never asked about, and Damien never offered to explain, and she let that silence stand, understanding there were corners of this world that protecting her children meant not looking into too closely. Markov's network, weakened by the information the third man on the boat had finally desperately given up under interrogation, fractured over the following months into something Damien's remaining allies were able to dismantle piece by piece, until the name itself stopped carrying the particular cold weight it had carried that first terrible night in the grocery store parking lot. Jack and Noah grew the way children grow when they're loved fiercely by two parents who have finally, painfully, learned to talk to each other instead of around each other. Jack remained loud and protective and stubborn, the boy who'd looked a stranger in the eye on a dock and refused to be afraid even with a hand clamped over his mouth. Noah stayed quiet and watchful, the boy who noticed everything and said little, who took nearly 8 months before he stopped flinching at the sound of boat engines and longer still before he slept a full night without waking once to check that his mother was still in the room. It was a late spring evening, nearly a year after the night on the dock, when Vivian found herself standing in the doorway of Damien's study with a framed photograph in her hands. Not the sonogram, which still lived folded in a small frame on his desk, soft-creased and permanent, but a new photograph, the four of them together, taken on the back terrace the previous weekend. Jack mid-laugh with his head thrown back, Noah's small hand gripping his father's with a trust that had taken the better part of a year to build one patient breakfast, one kept promise, one quiet bedtime story at a time. Damien looked up from the desk when she came in, and something in his face had changed completely from the man she'd watched sit behind that same desk a year earlier, carrying a 4-year-old grief he didn't know how to put down. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who had stopped bracing for the next disaster and started simply living inside the life he'd fought to keep. "I thought this should go here," Vivian said, crossing to the desk and setting the new photograph down beside the old one. The worn sonogram, and the bright new family portrait sitting together on the same dark wood where, 2 years and one entire lifetime ago, everything had nearly fallen apart over 5 misread seconds. Damien looked at the two photographs side by side for a long moment, and when he looked back up at her, his eyes were wet in a way he didn't try to hide anymore, didn't apologize for, the careful control of the man she'd married finally giving way to something steadier and more honest. "No more silence," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was something closer to a vow, the same kind they'd both broken once already and had spent a year learning how to actually keep. "No more silence," Vivian agreed. Outside, through the tall windows of the study, the late sun was dropping gold across the water, and she could hear the boys' voices carrying up from the garden, Jack's laugh sharp and bright, Noah's lower, steadier. The two of them chasing something across the lawn with the kind of total, unguarded joy that only comes to children who have finally, completely stopped being afraid. Damien came around the desk and stood beside her at the window, his hand finding hers without either of them announcing the gesture. Just two people who had spent a year relearning how to reach for each other instead of away, watching their sons run through the last gold light of the day toward absolutely nothing in particular, toward no danger and no shadow and no convoy of black cars waiting in any parking lot anywhere. Just two boys, laughing, home, safe, and entirely, finally, theirs.